Hello and welcome to Solo Board Gaming Presents Wing Leader Victories 1940 to 1942, designed of course by brimmacombe-wood and produced by GMT Games. This is the second edition, dated 2019. Look at that cover art. Look at that beautiful cover art with that amazing P-40 Warhawk there, or of course Tomahawk in Commonwealth service. And that box art, of course, is by Antonis Karidis. This is not an unboxing video. It's not a rules video. I am going to be doing some playthroughs in a series, and I hope that a few of you will be interested in that. No, this episode is a detailed introduction, an overview, an explanation of the key concepts of Wing Leader Victories and its sister production, Wing Leader Supremacy. So the reason I want to try and show the key concepts is to maybe correct some misunderstandings and convince those that have yet to take the plunge and still haven't actually purchased this game, because if you love World War II aircraft, you will love this game. Or it's also for those that still have it on the shelf and haven't quite got it to the table. Once you get those key concepts, you get the design. I said it's not an unboxing, but it's worth just mentioning you get a fabulous rule book in here. And again, we don't want to put too many people off. It certainly wouldn't put war gamers off as such, but it's 48 pages long, but that includes an extensive index. There's bags of illustrations and notes and colour illustrations, and it's beautifully set out and pretty easy to understand. It really does flow. And I said it's 48 pages, but once you've read the first 30 pages, you can start playing the game. Read the first 30 pages and then start playing the game, because after that, after page 31, it's advanced rules. Where are we? Advanced rules, where we're discussing even single aircraft units taking off, surface units and things like that, barrages. Because then once you've got the basics up to page 30, and that's not difficult, I would call that medium weight rules. And then once you've got those and have played through the first few scenarios, which are learning scenarios, you can start adding advanced rules as and when you see fit, as and when you are comfortable. That's an easy rule book to get through. It really is. And talking of those scenarios, here's the Wing Leader Victories scenario book. Again, beautiful artwork there. And there are 30 scenarios in here, no less than 30 scenarios. Look. And with each scenario, it takes the usual form where it's usually a page each. Some stretch over onto a second page. It shows opposing forces. It gives you historic background and any special rules and your victory conditions. And the first several scenarios are training scenarios, gradually introducing various different rules. Now, this game is absolutely soloable. It's dead easy to solo, particularly where you have bombers following a fixed path on a raiding mission and you need to intercept them. That's so easily soloable. Then you'll add escorts and sweep fighters, ground targets and things like that, and still you would merely play both sides to the very best of your ability. But many of the movement rules are still automatic, depending on what those aircraft are doing, what their mission is, and how aware they are at the time. Very soloable. So, all you solitaire players out there, or all you guys that were waiting for an opponent, wait no longer. Now, finally, you get brilliant player aids, of course, typically GMT quality. You get a wing display, which keeps most of the management counters off the board and on the wing displays. And you also get a battle display so you can remove crowded aircraft off the board onto a battle display to spread them out and carry out your interception or your dogfight or whatever. And I'm not going to say much more than that as regards content. The rest now is talking about the key concepts in Wing Leader Victories 1940 to 42. Let's start having a good look. Now, bear with me, don't let this put you off, but we're going to have a good look around the board. And I know people don't like this kind of thing, but there's no getting away from it. We see it on other air war games, and we also see it on naval games. We see it in desert warfare. The fact that our map or our playing area is basically plain and fairly clear. And this is no different. We get a huge board basically showing the sky, and we're not looking down from the top onto the ground, not at all. We're not looking up at the sky, we're looking side on. Imagine we're on a huge tall tower and this sky is in front of us. And there is a few things on the map. First of all, there's the surface. There it is. See that green line here running down the bottom of the map? That is the surface, and it can act as either the land or the sea depending on where your mission is taking place. There it is. There's a couple of features like so. Okay, so if that helps orient you now, there's the ground, and it starts off at level 0. Each square is numbered. There's various axes numbered on the board. There's the X and Y axis, and we start at level 0 down here, ground level. Where are we? There we are. That's level 0, and we can put surface units here if the mission calls for them, and some aircraft will actually be at level 0 from time to time, either taking off or on dive bombing or ground attack, strafing missions, and it goes all the way up to level 19 right at the top. So it's 0 to 19, and along the bottom we have A to Z. Okay, so I think you're seeing now that it's a side-on view of the sky, a side-on view, and this is one of the key concepts right here. So we have our X and Y axis. Now the Z axis or Z axis is here. So we have to imagine the near and far Z axis. This will become clearer in a moment, the reason for that. We do have some other scenery to put on there. We have clouds. Like so. We can have wispy clouds. That's wispy clouds. We can have another layer of broken clouds, like so. We can have a layer of dense cloud. And this weather, wispy cloud, broken cloud, dense cloud, will have an impact on the game. And of course, we have the beautiful side-on aircraft counters. So let me put that on there. A couple of squadrons of Ki-21 Sally bombers of the Japanese Air Force, and zoom in a little bit further. So here we have those Japanese Sally bombers cruising towards their target, flying quite low at the moment at level 5. And again, you can see it's a side-on view. So we're looking at them from the side, and there's these fantastic illustrations straight out of aircraft data books or your Airfix modelling instructions. Absolutely beautiful. There's dozens and dozens of these counters covering all aircraft types from the early war years. Let's give them a couple of escorts. Here, for instance, let's give them a squadron of Ki-43 Hayabusa. And now let's add also a flight of Hayabusa. And there you can see the difference. Now, squadrons show multiple aircraft on the counters. Basically, it shows 2 aircraft. So that's a squadron, as is this and this. This, however, shows a single silhouette, and that's a flight. Now, each scenario will tell you how many aircraft are in those squadrons or flights. But if I tell you that basically a flight can be, well, where are we? There we are. A flight can be anywhere from 2 to 6 aircraft, but more normally 3 or 4 aircraft. And a squadron, anywhere from 8 to 12 aircraft. So these counters are not representing single aircraft. They're representing groups of aircraft on a mission together and fighting as groups of aircraft. Let's see if I have another example of that. Here we go. That's a squadron of P-40B Warhawks, Flying Tigers, and this is a flight of the P-40B Warhawk, the Flying Tigers. And just by way of comparison, just because I have it here with me, there is a P-40E Warhawk of the Flying Tigers, slightly different colour scheme. So you can see how detailed and individual all of these counters are. I don't quite know how the publisher has managed to do this. It's absolutely brilliant. So let's just pan out a little bit more again. Now, combat only takes place when 2 or more aircraft are in the same square together. Okay? Now, this is part of that key concept. Aircraft fly around the sky, trying to gain altitude to get to one another, struggling to gain altitude on many occasions, and this is going to differ depending on the aircraft type, in order to intercept, to fly towards a vector. And even theoretically, an aircraft can be in the same square as another aircraft without actually seeing the other aircraft. It hasn't yet tallied that other aircraft. I'll explain that in a moment. It hasn't yet tallied it. And that's because, don't forget, the Z or Z axis. In that, they may be in the same square, but they still may be a mile away from each other and not actually spotting each other or reacting to one another. You see, it's only if one has a tally on the other and they're in the same square that combat occurs. Now that's important because within that Z-axis, aircraft will fly around the sky. You can maneuver as much as you like on some top-down games. However, most top-down games are of a scale that the aircraft involved are already, if you like, in the same square. Because before that, they're flying towards one another for miles or for thousands of feet, and it's only when they get behind each other or directly above one another or directly in front of one another, that's where air combat begins. And that's why you're looking at a side-on view. The Z-axis doesn't really have any effect on the actual combat that's about to take place. Now, the other thing, of course, is, let me move a couple of these out of the way. Being in a side profile, these aircraft can face in any one of 8 directions. 1, 2, 3, straight up climbing. I'll explain that in a second. Flip it over. 4, 5, 6, straight down. 7, 8. Okay? Any one of 8 directions. And the facing is very important because that shows intent and where that aircraft's attention is. Plus, we need to know that facing to know whether an aircraft is attacking out of the sun whether it's been bounced, whether it's a head-on attack, all of which will affect the first round of combat. Now, I know there are some comments where some people show shots of the game and they have their aircraft pointed straight up or even straight down. Don't take it too literally. Yes, you can go from this square to this square. And different aircraft, by the way, have different rates of climb. And those rates of climb actually change depending on what altitude band you're in. And when you're in one of the top altitude bands, your aircraft is straining to climb, really slowed down. It has inertia and it's gasping for breath, that engine. So, even if you have turned your aircraft temporarily straight up to make a move like so, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's pointing straight up. It's probably really on a power climb, that's all it means, and it's probably spiraling as it's climbing upwards, desperately trying to gain height. But at least we know what its intention is and where its attention is focused. But obviously, in reality, most aircraft are actually climbing like so, or even like so. But to do so in the game, we need to turn, make that climb, and you can, when you get to that square, reorient your aircraft depending on where your next intention is or where your particular focus is at that point. And so, just one more thing to lead us into the next important concept in the game. Notice on, let's take these Sally bombers here. Notice on these Sally bombers, there's no real information on the aircraft counter. There's the aircraft type, the KI-21, and there's a letter, and that's just an ID. This is counter X. Let's look at another one. This P40B Squadron. This is B. The counter ID is B. Now there's nothing more on the actual aircraft counter. So where is the data pertaining to this aircraft? What's its performance? How do we know? Well, that brings us on to the next key concept, the aircraft data cards. And so here we are with all the ADCs, the aircraft data cards that you get just in the base set of Wing Leader Victories. And just in this base set, there are 44 aircraft data cards. So 44 completely different aircraft or occasionally different versions of an aircraft where there was a significant step change. And not forgetting that on the back of each aircraft, for instance, let's take the F4 Wildcat here, the Grumman F4 Wildcat. On the back of each and every one of these aircraft data cards, we have some history of the actual aircraft itself, and yet more variants. Here's an earlier variant, the Martlet in British service, for instance, Martlet Mark 1, which was the F4, F3. And were that specified in a scenario, you would reduce its firepower to 1. Because if we look over here, the F4, F4, the firepower there, by my thumb, is 2. But to play the Martlet or the F4, F3 Wildcat, you would reduce it to 1. So not only do we have these 44 aircraft, we also have different variants on the back. And I need to emphasize yet again, this is just the base set, just for playing the 30 scenarios in the base set. And of course, you can also add expansions. Just imagine that, more aircraft, more variants, more scenarios. So another key concept then, how do the aircraft data cards, the ADCs, work? Let's have a bit of a closer look. Now, the concept of the data cards, there's a lot that can be initially quite misunderstood about these. Let's take the BF109E here and also have a look at the Messerschmitt 110C. Their data is here in this matrix, and we have altitude bands, and then we have speed, turn, and climb. And indeed, most of this data is only used when they come together with another aircraft in the same square in combat. They're not used, not even speed, for movement on the map itself, because that, in effect, is irrelevant. It's how they interact together once they get into a diving or a turning combat. And this is where the misunderstanding takes place. People can argue forever about, for instance, how much faster the BF-109 was versus the Hurricane or the Spitfire. But when you're in a squadron in melee with your opposite number, very little of that matters. And that's when we use the speed and turn ratings shown on the data card, not for movement on the map, but once they've entered combat. So that you'll find the biggest difference is when you have a generational change. We'll have a look in a second, for instance, to the later model 109F, the F4. But for now, we're talking about relative data for a flight or a squadron of aircraft, how they behave together in that aerial battle, not individuals. And then much of the difference between, for instance, the Spitfire and the 109E, which probably had a speed difference, if you really want to talk about that, under lab test conditions of about 10 to 15 mile per hour in favour of the 109. The difference is how the combat is met. Has it been out of the sun? Is it a diving combat? Are they close escorts, or are they on a much more loose fighter sweep? Are the pilots in that squadron veteran, or are they green? And this is where your differences are going to tell. Or flights of aircraft, so 3 aircraft, 8 or 9 aircraft, and flown by average pilots. So average pilots that are trained, they've reached a reasonable training level. Anything over and above that would be veteran Sturmovik squadron there, for instance, let's say, or a really green Hurricane squadron, where most of those replacements are fresh out of flight school. And it's that, along with the tactical doctrine and their actual mission, that we're going to see the biggest differences. So of course, when you see a difference in maneuverability, when we see them, you Google it or you see it in a book, you get all the technical specifications of particular aircraft, and you're trying to compare them, the 109E, the Spitfire Mark 1A, something like that. And you're thinking, the 109 was faster than the Spitfire. Well, that varies dependent upon what altitude we're at, and it's under laboratory test conditions, all that kind of spec. And it's the maximum that an expert pilot who has the most skill and experience can wring out of that particular aircraft. On the data card, you're getting the data which shows the kind of performance most pilots with average training would get out of that aircraft on any given day. So hopefully that's clearer. I can emphasize this with one more revisionist piece of analytical history. In World War II, if we look at 100% of aircraft kills and 100% of fighter pilots, only 4% of those fighter pilots were the guys that took down or were responsible for 40% of those kills. Just let that sink in. 4% of fighter pilots were responsible for 40% of kills. And this is what makes this game so brilliant. The other 60% of pilots, much of the time, would absolutely spend much of their time scared to death, but diving through formations, blatting off some rounds, not hitting a single thing, exiting into a clear blue sky, not having a clue where everybody's disappeared to, and eventually heading for home. That's the reality of aerial combat in World War II. So that's a really key concept to bear in mind, and it's a good one. Now, something else I want to point out. Let's have a bit of a closer look once again. So let's emphasise what a couple of these aircraft types and variants look like on the map, focusing in here on some of these early war US aircraft. Let's have a look at the F2. The F2A3 Buffalo, there it is in its US colours. So how about the same aircraft in RAF colours? Look at that! That's the Buffalo, but they even give you the RAF colours for the same aircraft. Because, you guessed it, there are scenarios that include it. So there it is. There's the Buffalo in US colours and RAF colours. How about the Havoc? Well, the US A20 Havoc with an American paint scheme. And can I just get that on there as well? There's the RAF paint scheme, the Boston. So, just imagine, I've shown you data cards for 44 different aircraft types, but there are dozens more individual aircraft, variants and nationalities of these aircraft that go on the board. There's the US Havoc, there's the RAF Boston, the ill-fated TBD-1 Devastator. There she is in her early war US colours. The F4F Wildcat. A couple of different paint jobs like so. How's that? Absolutely stunning. Those are two different flights, obviously, of aircraft. So there's a couple of, and there are dozens of those, all different squadron colours. And can you see his data card here for a Blenheim Mark IV? It doesn't end there, because on the back you've got variants. For instance, the Blenheim Mark I. There she is. Absolutely stunning. So again, that increases the amount of aircraft types. I'm going to put a Gladiator there. Look, there's a Gladiator. There, for instance, can you believe it? A ferry battle, no less. And yes, you will be attacking those bridges at Sedan and falling out of the sky in large numbers. Or will you? Absolutely stunning. Genius to include the ferry battle. Let's pop back and have a look at some of the German aircraft. I think I have a couple of Stukas here. Okay, here's our Stuka data card. Here's a Luftwaffe Stuka, absolutely fantastic. But look, here's an Italian Stuka. Wow! Absolutely mind-blowing. And down here, some 109s with all sorts of different colour schemes. Both of these are 109Es. There's so many different BF 109 colour schemes on these aircraft counters. But if you haven't had enough 109 Emil action, may I present you a 109E of the Romanian Air Force. Yes, superb. And here's some ME110s, again with different paint jobs. See? There. And now, if this won't convince you to go out and buy this game immediately, nothing will. Allow me to introduce some of the most beautiful aircraft ever designed. There's several colour schemes for these. There's one Fiat G50 there. There's another Fiat G50 here. Absolutely stunning. Quick rush to your favourite game store. And here we have a Mackie 202. Folgore. Stunning. And for my finale, allow me to present the SM79 Hunchback in various colour schemes. Wow. You shouldn't even be watching this anymore. You should have turned it off, put your coat on, and be running down to your game shop. And the same here. More colour schemes for the CR42s. And those are the aircraft data cards as a concept and how they're represented on the board. So the next key concept then is the concept of movement on the board and the order in which that's carried out. In other words, why are the rules like this? Now don't forget, this is not a rules video, so we're not going into detail, just discussing the concept. Okay, so I've set up here something similar, but not exactly, to Scenario 2 in the scenario book actually. I'm using the same kind of aircraft anyway. So movement points then. Now, first of all, it's dictated by not the data cards. Remember, the data on the data cards kicks in once combat is joined. No, what we're discussing is movement on the map. And that will depend on what kind of mission you're on. Bombing, fighter sweep, escort, intercept, and that kind of thing. And notice, none of that information is actually on the map, because once again, it's kept off the map, and we won't discuss it now, but it's kept on your wing display. So, on your wing display, you would have counters managing each individual flight or squadron. You'd have an identifier, like for instance, this is X squadron and this is Y squadron. You'd have X and Y, for instance, here. So, at a glance, you can tell what mission it's on. It'll say bombing. Or whether this fighter squadron here, B, for instance, is alerted or unalerted, or if it's on a sweep or an escort mission, if it's short of ammo and all that. So all of that is on the wing display. It's not on the map. So let's say we've established that, and we can come on to how we actually move and in what sort of order. Now, first of all, bombers will simply trundle along on their mission, not changing height until some scenarios call them to fly a bombing profile, for instance. Other scenarios just require them to fly straight ahead. And this is another reason why this game is good for solo. So bombers, for instance, will have 2 movement points, and each square is a movement point. So they would fly 1, 2. 1, 2, like so. If they had close escorts, the escorts would move first. These fighters here are on a sweep mission. They have a little bit more freedom. Then unalerted fighters would move. Unalerted fighters. Now the sweep fighters here, on their wing display, it would show us that they have started the game unalerted. They're on a mission, yes, but they have no specific alert to a specific threat. So unalerted fighters move next, and they also have 2 movement points. 1, 2. 1, 2. The next thing that moves is alerted fighters. Now, these statuses can change throughout the game. An unalerted fighter can become alerted, for instance. But the interceptors here, they're on an intercept mission, are already alerted. It makes sense. They have been scrambled to a vector 10,000 feet over Rangoon, for instance, or in other scenarios over Dover. So they've been scrambled to a vector and therefore they're absolutely alerted. So alerted fighters move last. Why? And here's one of the first key concepts in movement. He who moves first is at a disadvantage because the most alerted of us can move last. A little bit counterintuitive, but don't forget, we can now react, if you like, to what else has happened on the board. So let's say alerted interceptor A has a vector here. It's been vectored to this point. Flight B of the alerted interceptors has a vector, I don't know, let's put it here. So that's the vectors that we've started the game with. So we've had our bombers move, we've had our escorts move, then any bombers, then any sweep fighters. They've all had 2 movement points. Alerted fighters have 3 movement points. They've opened the throttle a little. Okay? So they always have to move towards their vector. Now, let's take A. The rule here is he has to close the distance between himself and his vector by at least 1 square. If the vector is at a higher altitude, he also has to climb at least 1 altitude towards his vector. So he gets a free turn, turning in the square, looks on his data card, and let's say at this altitude it costs 2 movement points per altitude gain. 2 movement points there, and don't forget he has 3. Can't climb another altitude because that would be another 2 points. He's only got 1 left. So he could either stay like that or he could spend that last point in the square. And I think that's what we'll do. We'll spend our last points in the square, pointed towards our vector, and because we're climbing, we put a climb marker on, which shows -1 to our speed, not our movement points. It has nothing to do with movement on the board and everything to do with the speed rating on the data card. Because if we get into combat now, that's when the -1 speed takes effect because of the inertia of climbing, but doesn't affect our movement points on the board. B is climbing towards his vector here. Turns, that costs him 2 movement points out of his 3. And he's going to spend his last movement point like so. He's satisfied the conditions. He's reduced the distance between him and his vector and climbed 1 altitude. And although he's straightened out, that makes no difference. He's still affected by that climb. If he got into combat now, he would have -1 speed. So there's a concept right there. It's the energy from diving, or I've been calling it inertia, haven't I? So I'll stick to that for the moment. The inertia from climbing that's going to affect that combat. So you're always thinking as you get closer and closer about what condition you're putting yourself in should you be attacked. So just to reiterate this concept, there's a movement order which is basically governed by what your alert status is and also your mission. So escorts move first, and that unalerted, so it would only be 2 movement points. The bombers move unalerted 2 movement points. The sweep fighters moved, unalerted 2 movement points. These guys get 3 movement points, but when you're climbing and it gets harder and harder, they could get into the next break point where it would actually cost 3 movement points just to increase 1 altitude. Climbing to altitude is very difficult, and you really have to plan ahead when you're setting your vectors and things like that. So all that's easy to remember. We're not zooming around the sky at all. Don't take too much notice of the distances between them, in the sense that the scale is a little bit abstract. There's a lot of sky here still. And don't forget, this aircraft here could actually be a mile this way. Yeah, so if you just bear that in mind, that would help. So, on to the next concept in this portion, and that's tallying. Tally ho! Tallying is a fascinating concept. You tally a unit if you spot the unit. You can interpret it like that. It's not quite that simple, because you can build your own narrative. And don't forget, we still have that Z-axis, the Z-axis. So you could say that sometimes a unit does spot another unit, but decides not to do anything about it. It has greater priorities. It still wants to gain height. So he's not going to tally him. In other words, select him as a target. Okay, so you can think of it like that. Selecting a target rather than simply spotting. However, vision does come into it, of course. This is by way of trying to explain the concept of tallying. Now, the first to tally would be the fighters of the radar of the Japanese here. So let's say Squadron B is going to try and tally this unit here. He has to roll 1 dice with certain modifiers greater than the distance away of the target. So he's 1, 2, 3. So he would have to roll a 4 or more on a dice for a successful tally. There are various modifiers on the table. There's quite a lot, actually. For instance, if this target was in a big formation of 3 aircraft counters all adjacent to one another, that would make it an easier tally. That makes sense. If he was a veteran, his experience would give him a plus modifier. That makes sense. If it's affected by cloud, for instance, if there was a layer of broken cloud here, okay, let's put it here. So it affects 2 squares. That's made it harder now. He's trying to spot him through the cloud. And broken cloud, see this number 2? That gives a 2 modifier. So now he's got to roll a 1, 2, 3. He's got to roll a 4 plus the 2. He's got to roll a 6. That's the only way he's going to spot him. So let's say, after all the modifiers, he's spotted him. He now puts his tally token, and it's Unit B, on that unit. That unit is now tallied by this guy here. Now, when the movement happens, it's different, because this guy goes from unalerted to alerted. So he goes from 2 movement points to 3, because he's opening his throttle. See how all this is making sense now, like real air combat. But it also changes the movement order. So the escorts move, the bombers move, they're 2 movement points. Unalerted fighters move in initiative order, the lower one first. They're alerted. Unalerted fighters, it's him, because he's now alerted. So he now moves. He doesn't know what's going on. They go ahead by 2. If these guys had radios and were on the same radio net, because that comes into it as well, which is amazing, then this guy could have alerted his buddy that he's tallied a squadron down here. So he could try and tally, and he would get a +1 modifier to the tally. make it a bit easier. That's how the radios work. However, so unalerted Squadron's move. Notice he hasn't, because he's now alerted and he's tallied this one. So now the alerted Squadron's move, he still has to climb towards his B vector. So he turns and goes 2. He can't climb anymore. He's tallied and he still has the climb marker on him. Now the next one is, because B has a tally on him, B is the next to react. In other words, if you have a tally on another squadron, you react to his movements. And again, so much sense. So now he's going to react, and he's got 3 movement points, and he's going 1, turning and diving into his square. And he's going to have an advantage in combat because he'll have a +1 dive marker on him, and combat will take place. Now, in this particular situation where this Hayabusa is diving on the P40, I would want to know the position of the sun. And I love this part of the game. On the back of the rule book, it shows the different positions that the sun can be found in. Here at the top. Okay. And if the sun was in the right upper quadrant, relative to the aircraft, which is here, you see, so this would be the angle of the sun. And it absolutely occurs in this particular instance. It means that this Hayabusa is diving out of the sun. The P40 is blinded by that. So the Hayabusa gets a bounce advantage. And that's all worked out. So important from the sun arcs on the back of the rule book. You see the different sun arcs, the different possibilities as to where the sun could be. And it changes from scenario to scenario. So when you are moving around the sky, you might want to maneuver yourself into a more favourable position before you launch your attack. Particularly, for instance, on a formation of bombers and things like that. The sun plays also an important role in tallying. This guy can try and tally the bombers, and they're below the sun arc, so there's no problem there. Or he tries to tally one of these. This one would be in his sun arc, if the sun arc was top right. So that would be detrimental to trying to tally him because he's blinded by the sun. However, let's just move them again. Can we still see that? Yeah. Let's just say that there was some cloud here. Broken cloud or dense cloud. And the sun was still in that top right arc. Like that, the sun is going to play a part in him trying to tally these guys. But if that cloud was there, hiding the sun, you see, he's got a better chance of getting the tally. Absolutely brilliant concepts in air warfare and so realistic. The concept of combat and cohesion, which plays a huge part in this game, and again is one of the very realistic concepts of the game design. Okay, Squadron of Sallies, the Warhawks are joining combat by diving into them like so. Could be here, and this is where you see one of those odd positionings that I was mentioning earlier in the video. He could dive on them like so. Okay, so he gets a dive marker, so he gets a speed bonus there. Now, When you see an aircraft like that, what's he done? It's pretty obvious. He's done a wing over and he's attacking from directly above like so. Now, the first thing you've got to do is decide by looking at the data card what kind of combat you want this to be. So if I just put the data card there for the Warhawk, I have to decide whether I want it to be a speed combat or a turning combat. I'm at altitude 7, so I look at 4 to 9. I can choose speed or turning because they're both the same. Really, you'd want to choose your most advantageous type of combat, speed or turning combat. Speed, you're going to be just diving and blatting away right through the squadron. You're going to dive through the squadron, giving very little chance for the bombers to react and retaliate. I could choose a turning combat. That's where instead of diving through the squadron, I'm manoeuvring myself behind a bomber aircraft like so and lining it up for the shot. I can do that. I might get a better shot off, but that also gives chance for the bomber to retaliate with a +2 modifier. I mean, the bomber, even if I'm diving through, he's going to have a pop anyway, but he's going to get a +2 modifier if I start a turning combat manoeuvring behind him, for instance. So if I stick to my diving combat, bang. And this is the concept. You're going to dive through. The combat results are going to be worked out on the matrix. Did you get any hits? Did he get any hits? Did you get a kill? Did he get a kill? But what happens then is cohesion. And this is where the big blue sky really comes into effect. Once you've decided to go into an attack, and remember this is a flight of aircraft, it's not a single aircraft, it could be a squadron. If I'd have chosen that counter there, that's a squadron. It could be 8, 9, 10 aircraft. This is a flight of 3 or 4 aircraft. Are we going to still be manoeuvring together afterwards? Are we still going to be a cohesive unit? So after the battle, we take a cohesion check and we could end up disrupted. Now, if we'd have chosen the squadron, which is much more aircraft, and he gets a disrupted marker, which goes on his wing display, not on the board, that's detrimental to his future combats. There are modifiers. Has he got radios, which will help keep his aircraft together? Has he had losses? Does he have low ammo? All these things, veteran green, go into deciding whether he's going to still be a cohesive unit at the end of it. If he fails and gets 1 level of disruption, that'll count against him next time. A second level of disruption is broken. So you can go from disrupted to broken. There's the marker there. Disrupted side doesn't go on the board, it goes on your wing display. And that would be the broken side. Let me take the squadron off. Put the flight back on. Less aircraft, let's say 4. If he rolls disrupted, because he's a flight, he actually goes straight to broken because there's less aircraft. It's easier for them to break up completely. And in that case, they dive out of the formation and, like an ever-expanding bubble, emerge into a clear blue sky a few hundred feet below, not knowing where one another are anymore, and basically they head for home. So in other words, a flight is a single-step unit, whereas a squadron is a 2-step unit. So after every combat, a cohesion check, when you've been successful in combat or not, is taken, and various elements come into play to decide whether you're still an effective fighting unit. And regardless of all that, let's say you haven't disrupted, you're still a cohesive unit. After your first combat, you would get a low ammo marker, which gives you a -1 on your next cohesion check. And then a depleted ammo marker, which gives you a -2 to your next cohesion check. And it does make a difference with that cohesion roll, because as you and your guys are bursting out below the bomber formation, whether you have any ammo left at all makes a difference as to whether you head home or you keep fighting. That's a vital concept in this game. Well, I hope it's been useful. I hope this has whetted your appetite. Remember, it wasn't a rules video, just discussing those key concepts, just to get your head around. And then you'll start to realise what this game is all about. And to put all that together, and so that we can go through the detailed rules, we'll do a full playthrough. Or maybe a series of them. I don't know. Let me know in the comments below. But regardless of all that, I have to thank you for watching. That's really appreciated. And join me again next time as we reach for the skies and indulge in some air combat. Thanks very much. See you again soon. Bye bye.